All right, here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Native CDFI Network's weekly Friday COVID update call. We've been doing this call since since the pandemic started, and we've been able to do this almost every Friday. So this is our 31st edition. We've had some really wonderful, insightful guests, and today is just like all the other Fridays. And we have another wonderful, insightful guest here, Dr. Ian Record from the National Congress of American Indians, who I think a lot of you know, and is really a great leader in the area and helping out Indian country. So thanks for joining us, Ian. And before we get started, kind of remind us of our purpose here. We're here to share with each other. We're here to learn with each other and connect as you all are, again, on the front lines of the economic downturn across Indian country. So thank you for what you do. We're here for our members. And so today's agenda is very similar to what we've done in the past. We'll go through some news announcements. And if anybody has any announcements, feel free to think of them. We will open it up then, or if you have other announcements toward the end, please share them with us. And then after that, we'll hear from Dr. Record, and then any final thoughts anyone has. And our board chairman, Pete Upton, wasn't able to make it this week, but he'll be back next week. Cool. So I'd like to start just, I think right now with the election and the transition going on, we had some questions about what this could mean for Native CDFIs and how Native CDFIs should position themselves. And fortunately, I've got some great news about our policy committee, who's going to be becoming more active and really getting engaged right around a good time. But some really high level news that I think most people know already. The Biden-Harris team has put together a transition team, which includes several Native American advisors who, two of the three people on this list have been guests of our Friday show and know Native CDFIs very well and are good friends of ours. So Janie Hipp from the Native American Ag Fund is a volunteer on that transition team, and as is Chris James from the National Center, who puts on the RES conference every year, and they're both volunteers. And Janie's with the Department of Interior's volunteer team, and Chris James is with the Small Business Administration, I think, their volunteer team. And then we also have Kevin Washburn, who is a member of the Chickasaw Nation, and he also is a dean at Iowa, a member of actually not a member, the head of the Department of Interior's transition team. So I think we have some folks who know Native CDFIs there, and we're going to work to engage them moving forward. I think it's also worth noting that Janet Yellen was named the nominee for Treasury Secretary, and that's the agency which we deal with most regularly. And so I think that's really the biggest name nominee that is on the Native CDFI radar. So, and I want to, and as always, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to jump right in. We got to, I think by now a lot of folks know each other, and I think it's fine to just jump right in. Cool. And also want to acknowledge Cindy Middlesat from our board secretary, and actually Pete Upton is on the call. And Pete, if you want to stop and pause and say anything, feel free. Cool. One other piece of news that I think we highlighted earlier today, we've been following the stimulus update talks, and I think we called it Groundhog Day because folks are saying the same thing over and over and every single week. And it's still kind of in the same limbo of really kind of an unlikely fourth stimulus. But if there is one, I guess one thing to feel good about is there's a bipartisan proposal that has a $12 billion set aside for CDFIs and minority depository institutions for lending. The caveat and challenge with this is this really the same problem we had in the CARES Act, where that set aside was then interpreted by the SBA, where most native CDFIs were left out and left behind and weren't able to participate in that. So while this bill really hasn't gained traction and there isn't any formal support from the White House or the the Senate leadership, we're keeping our eye on this in case it does move forward, and we want to make sure that the rules do not have the bend against smaller native CDFIs like they did in the CARES Act, which was really a problem. All right. And one other piece of news that we haven't shared yet, but is interesting. So the S212 we talked about a while back is this as a bill called the Indian Country Economic Enhancement Act, a bill that's been around for multiple Congresses. It actually passed the House of Representatives late last night, and it had passed the Senate. So in an ideal world, that would mean it would be sent to the president for signature. But that's not the case here. Apparently, the House had to make an edit, an amendment to the bill, which was small. I think only changed the date because the bill had been introduced in 2019, and now the bill is going to be passed in 2020. And so there's some, I guess, there's some discussion about whether or not that'll have to go back to the Senate, which is really disappointing. But to remind everybody, this is a bill that NCN has supported, and one of the greatest things it does is it permanently eliminates the matching requirement for native CDFIs at the CDFI fund. So just about every year, the CDFI fund waives this matching requirement, but that's done at the discretion of the department. And it's our belief that we should remove that so that our lenders and our native CDFIs can have that certainty moving forward into planning. So we're hopeful that this issue gets resolved. In order for it to pass the Senate, it's still got an uphill battle, even though it's passed already, because it would have to pass unanimously. So all 100 senators would have to approve of it. And there's only weeks left in the year. So this is an opportunity, but also challenging. Cool. And I want to remind folks, if you're not speaking and you don't have a comment, can you please mute your phone? That way we don't get any background feedback. Cool. Well, thanks. I think we took care of that. And we'll see if anybody has any questions about this this bill or anything else that's going on in Congress. All right, cool. Well, we have some great news today, and we just shared this earlier today. So the Native CDFI Network's Board of Directors, and like I said, we have Cormay Haskell on as Board of Directors, and Pete Upton and Cindy Middlestat, I think, are the Board of Directors on today, have selected a policy committee, and they are made up of 9 folks who are representing the 9 regions that we've been discussing as part of an NCN regional initiative we've been discussing since, I want to say, June of this past year. And we're really excited. We got a great team of folks. And I'll just read off the folks on this list. Mary Miner, who represents the Alaska region. She works with Alaska Growth Capital. And then from the Eastern region, we have Russ Siegel from Sequoia Fund. Out in Cherokee, North Carolina, and Tawny Brunch from the Great Plains. Rob Aiken from Leech Lake Financial Services representing the Midwest, Shalyn Kellogg with Shoshone Bannock CDFI in the Northwest, and Faisha Solomon from Hawaiian Lending and Investments, Tanya Plummer from Island Mountain CDFI, Stephen Hires from the Cherokee Nation Economic Development Corp. And there he's representing the Southern Plains, which includes Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas. And then we've got Dave. Congratulations, Dave, with Native Community Capital, and he's representing the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. So, and then in addition to that, we really had a strong interest in folks who wanted to contribute to the policy committee, and we've asked those folks to join on as regional members, and you can see the folks here who are listed as regional members. And if you are interested in helping out and serving and being involved at a regional level, please let us know. We want to make sure that our regions are engaged and we have a really dynamic and clean flow of information so that we're able to best represent and put forward good policy for Native CDFIs. And pause right here. So anyways, and with that, I just want to pause. Does anyone have any announcements? Cool. Hey, Stephanie, you want to break that down for us?
Just a reminder, we have an upcoming webinar with the Federal Home Loan Bank, and they're covering down payment assistance for Native communities. So just join us on Thursday, February 17th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And if you can't join us, we'll have it on the website. So hopefully you'll check it out.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Stephanie. And Stephanie's with the WISTA Corp. And they are really great help to Native CDFIs. So thank you, Stephanie. Cool. And all right. Well, I don't hear any other announcements, but if you have other announcements, folks, feel free to bring them up again at the end of the call. So now I'd like to get to the meat and kind of the fun stuff, and we get to meet our featured guest, Dr. Ian Record. And I know a lot of you know Ian, but he is the Vice President of Partnerships for the National Congress of American Indians. He also serves as the chairperson of the NCN Data and Impact Committee. And we'll have more information about the folks who have joined the Data and Impact Committee, including Andy, who's on the call today. So we'll have more information about that next week. Dr. Record is really, as I noted earlier, really been a leader in advancing policy and especially economic development work in Indian country. He worked at the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. He's obviously well educated. He's got a master's and a PhD from the University of Arizona. And he's also written several books. And I didn't know this, but I'm going to have to read one of your books, Ian. But with that, we asked Ian to come over and share with us a bit about what he's doing really at the National Congress of American Indians. They are a great resource and a great ally to us. He's worked on a number of different tools for both tribal leaders as well as Native CDFIs, and we thought that would be worth highlighting. And I think before we get into that, Ian, my question for you is, how did you become involved in and develop this passion for what you're doing with Indian country?
And how much time do we have? Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I've been asked that question a lot, particularly as a non-Native person who ended up in this role that I find myself today. Long story short, I grew up here in suburban Washington, and it wasn't until I went to college and not even in my college coursework, but on my own time, learning the truth about Native America and federal Indian policy and what it had done to Native peoples. And I was really pissed off, to put it mildly, and generated an interest in wanting to work in the field. Actually got an internship with the National Museum of the American Indian in their public affairs office back in the mid-90s, fresh out of my undergrad. And that sort of cemented my desire to dedicate my career to this work. And that led to grad school at University of Arizona, which led to the Native Nations Institute, which of course then led me to NCAI, and getting to do all the really cool work with you guys and so many other issue areas that I'm involved with. Did you want me to share my screen, Jackson?
I got it. I just wanted to hear a bit more about that.
Sure.
We had the slides in the back, but now we're good. And you just let me know when you want to move forward. And
sure, yeah. And I don't know if you're able to go to slideshow version down there, make it pop it up a little bit, because some of the, there we go. Some of these slides are kind of dense, but so my title is actually now Vice President for Tribal Governments and Special Projects. We've, over the last year or so, gone through a restructuring to address the rapid growth of the organization. And we now have 6 departments across NCAI, and mine includes the Partnership for Tribal Governance, which I was hired on to direct back in 2014, and then several other special projects, including things like overseeing our work on financial capability, which includes our stewardship of the Native Financial Education Coalition, which I know some of you are aware of or have interacted with. And that also includes a Native Financial Education Coalition website that has a ton of great resources on it for tribal leaders and practitioners who are looking for useful tools, research, data, resources to enhance their ability to grow financial capability among tribal leaders, among tribal citizens, those working in tribal government, et cetera. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to touch today on some of the current and forthcoming things that we're working on in this space, the general space of NCAI working to support tribal nations as they build sustainable tribal economies, resilient, particularly in the time of COVID, resilient tribal economies. And I wanted to spotlight a few things that we've done or will be doing, and its implications for Native CDFIs. We, at our recent annual convention that was held about 3 weeks ago, which was our first ever virtual annual convention, we held a breakout session that looked at what are the challenges, the strategic challenges facing tribal leaders and key decision makers when it comes to economic recovery, economy building, potentially economic transformation. So the transformation of tribal economies, given that it's likely that tribal economies are not going to be able to return to the exact state that they were in prior to COVID, just because in many industries, COVID has transformed irrevocably the just how fruitful those industries will be. Things like marketplace competitiveness will look different now, things like that. So we had a really fruitful discussion, which is now available on our YouTube channel. And it really looked at centering the tribal leaders needing to consciously center, if they're not already, but certainly given their efforts, given COVID and how they're working or should be working to deal with the long range impacts of the pandemic, really looking to center more fully private sector development, and really giving greater ownership of a larger proportion of tribal people in the building of an economy, primarily through the creating a more fertile ground for small businesses owned and operated by tribal citizens, and then supporting the development of those businesses in a variety of ways. Many of those ways you guys work to support through the services that your CDFIs provide. The other thing this conversation focused heavily on was the need for tribes to do as much action as they do talk, and do even more talk and action on doing business with your own people. So we hear a lot of tribal leaders spout rhetoric about that, about, yeah, we support our small businesses, we're all for our people owning and operating their own businesses, but are you really putting your money where your mouth is as a tribal government, as a tribal enterprise? And so we had a really fruitful discussion about that. We had Wizipan Little Elk from Rosebud, and also Melinda Charlo from Confederated Salish and Kootenays share what they're doing on those fronts. So Salish Kootenai has what we feel is one of the best procurement policies in the country when it comes to compelling the tribal government and the tribal businesses to actually do business with certified tribal and other Native American vendors who offer various goods and services that they're in need of. So we really thought this was a fruitful discussion, a good platform to build on. Next slide, please.
Actually, can you tell us a bit more about that? The Salish and Kootenays, what structure did they use to set that up?
Well, for one is they developed a procurement policy that they actually fully and consistently enforce. That's number one. It's a lot easier to draw up one of these policies on paper and quite another to consistently enforce it and to hold at bay any impulses on the part of tribal leaders to get involved in the administration of that policy. And it's really sort of how do you systematically create a culture where the norm is that the tribe does business with its own people and not the exception. And so, and they've got all of this stuff codified. They're very open about sharing with others on this. I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but they have something like if a bid from a tribal vendor comes within 10% of the lowest qualified bid, they will accept the tribal bid because they recognize that even if they might be paying slightly more for that good or service by going with that tribal vendor, the economic ripple effect positively within the community will be far greater than that additional money that they would spend on that particular contract. And there's other tribes that have similar things. What we're working to do is to really advance those as models that other tribes ought to be adopting some form of, taking the useful components of those, adapting them to their own circumstances and ratifying them and actually living them in practice. Salt River in Arizona also has a really good policy as well. And many other tribes do as well. I know there's Professor Miller shared from Arizona State University shared during the conversation that there's one tribe that he knows of that actually binds the tribal government to honor its contracts in its own constitution. So those kinds of institutional measures that ensure a fertile ground for a fertile ground and a binding nature of how commerce takes place in tribal communities, and really being intentional about how do you facilitate that so you can keep more dollars circulating locally within the tribal community, which everyone knows anecdotally, and there's a growing amount of data and research that show the incredible economic impact that takes place when you're intentional about that economic capture process and looking to stem those places where leakage takes place, leakage that in many tribal communities is severe. We're talking like 90 cents on the dollar that evaporates out of the tribal community in the matter of 1 to 2 to 3 days. And so really being intentional about that.
Great.
So this next project is something that it's been consuming a lot of my department's effort over the last couple of years. It's going to be a decision framing toolkit that looks at the kind of foundational building blocks that tribes need to be thinking about, need to come up with their own answers to when it comes to building sustainable tribal economies. For those of you who are aware of our past work in workforce development, in 2018, we released a decision framing toolkit on tribal workforce development and how can tribes be strategic in that area. This toolkit will replicate that approach, but focused on economic development. And it's going to centrally discuss the role of native CDFIs. The fact that when you look at one of these, a number of these 11 strategic considerations that we've identified and will be exploring in the toolkit, partnerships, again, kind of harkening back to what I said before, tribal governments can't go it alone when it comes to economic development. They have to be actively looking at systematically building partnerships across the spectrum, internally and externally. Internally with their own citizens, and that's both as small business owners and as consumers. Internally with, obviously their own enterprises, any other reservation-based organizations, whether it's a Boys and Girls Club or a native CDFI, for example, that should be a full coordinating partner on how economy building is going to take place in that space, in that geographic expanse that the tribe has identified it wants to build an economy in. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to be confined to just the reservation. It can go beyond. And then external partnerships in the form of everything from joint venture partners to academic institutions. How can you rely on partnerships with major colleges and universities to help you generate the data you need to make informed decisions about what direction you want to take your economy? How can you rely on those relationships to do things like labor market forecasting, both for the tribe and then the general region around you, so you know what kind of jobs are going to be available and what kind of jobs you're going to need? And then how do you prepare your own people to take on those jobs? So if you want to flip to the next section, I wanted to give you guys sort of a sneak peek into some of the visuals that we'll be featuring in the toolkit, and apologies for the very crude nature of these, but this is what I threw together on a PowerPoint slide with my limited graphic design capabilities. And these will be transformed by a professional graphic designer into something that looks a lot more visually engaging. But you see here these 11 considerations kind of positioned as critical gears in the tribe's economy building machine. All of these, they need to be consciously addressing all of these things if they want to really put a firm foundation in place, generate momentum, and sustain momentum over time. And it's really designed to get tribal leaders in particular to think beyond what's that next winning project that we can select, so I can show that I've done good in my campaign promise of jobs and income for tribal members. Hey, let's go into hemp, or hey, let's go into alternative energy, or hey, let's go into the next new fad thing that all the other tribal leaders are talking about. We're trying through this toolkit to get tribal leaders to think much more foundationally about this. It's about your job as a tribal leader is to create an environment in which any industry you go into has the best chance of success. And then we're going to equip them with some tools and examples with each one of these about workable strategies, leading approaches that we've identified across Indian country, that sort of thing. So you can go to the next slide.
Okay. I just got a question. So
Sure.
If you are a native CDFI and you want to make this case to your tribal leadership, where do you think the native CDFIs would fit in that? I'm looking at partnerships, institutions, values.
Well, I think all of that, the values part really goes back to getting tribal leaders to take a hard look at their own current governance system, frankly, at their entire governance system, and then the tools that they're using to engage in economic development, and say, are these ours first and foremost? Do we really own these, or are these someone else's tools? And if they're someone else's tools, do they really were they really designed to meet our long-term needs? And secondly, are those systems and tools culturally appropriate? Do they reflect our values? Do they enact our values? Do they advance our values? Do they strengthen our values? And that's everything from, how we determine whether or not to get into a new industry, to how we actually run our enterprises. And I think CDFIs have a role in all of this. You think about integration. One of the things we're really going to hammer in this toolkit is the importance of all of these economic activities being integrated as much as possible and leveraging off one another. And I know, I see Cindy on the screen here. You know, Cindy and I had a conversation about this, I don't know, a month or two ago, where we were talking about this very thing about how do you have the tribal government, the tribal enterprises, the native CDFI all working in concert and leveraging off one another and sort of stimulating in a very intentional way that system of commerce that can sort of make that tide rise for all boats in the community, right? And that's really what we're looking to highlight there. So here's another one of the visuals that we're going to be featuring, is really getting tribal leaders to understand that sovereignty and economy go hand in hand, and that it's sort of a mutually reinforcing cycle, if you will, and to not think of them separately, to not relegate tribal economic development to, oh, it's the job of a department, and we'll put all of the responsibility for that in the hands of our department or in the hands of our economic development corporation. And our department, that sort of thing, is to really see them as parts of a single whole, and that you have to be growing both of them together in unison. And obviously that will look very different from one nation to the next, but you know, we really want to get across that the more intentional you are about building your economy, and the more time you spend on building the foundations for that economy, that you in turn strengthen your sovereignty, and then when you strengthen your sovereignty, you then in turn enhance your ability to engage in economy, if that makes sense. And I imagine most of you guys understand this far better than me because you actually do this work directly. I study it sort of secondhand, but you know, this is one way of explaining in a very concise fashion what more than 30 years of research has shown on Native nation rebuilding and economic and community development, that, you know, you can't approach these two things in a siloed manner. They have to be intentionally and consciously married to one another. So this is another visual we're going to be featuring, and it's a little, I understand because of the density of it, it's a little hard to read everything, but we wanted to be very clear and explicit with how NCI views, based upon all of the research that has been done and our analysis of it, what the optimal roles of all of these entities are, if you will, that can and should be contributing to economy building. And many of you know that in still today in some tribal communities, you don't have all of these entities contributing to the design and implementation of an economy. It's sort of a ground level. It's you know, tribal leaders making all the decisions, and then they may delegate some implementation to some other people. You'll have tribal administrators may or may not be involved in varying degrees, tribal enterprise staff, economic development corporation CEO, that kind of stuff. But we wanted to create a visual where we said, you know, where are you at as a nation with involving all of these entities? Because all of these entities can play critical roles in your ability to build an economy. And so what we wanted to emphasize is, again, being intentional about internally, who can contribute, who can help empower your economy, who should be helping to empower your economy, what kind of roles can they play? So tribal citizens, they absolutely have a role in helping leaders set strategic priorities for economy building. Because we've seen time and again, both in my work at University of Arizona and NNI, and then here at NCAI, tribal leaders can have all the greatest ideas in the world about how to build an economy. And even if they get consensus among the leadership within a tribe to go, let's go down this road, if the tribal citizens are not on board, if they don't feel like they own it, if they don't feel like they're being communicated to about it, they're gonna find a way to derail that at some point, whether that economic approach makes sense or not, whether it's good business or not, it doesn't matter. So how do you involve your tribal citizens at the outset in the design of the direction you want to take your economy? And then how do you make sure that you're informing them every step of the way, that you continue to learn from them, that sort of thing. You know, as I mentioned, citizens also should be owning and operating small businesses. And then there ought to, again, be systems in place, incentives for tribal citizens to actually do business with those businesses. You know, tribal governments across the board need to be doing a lot more to incentivize their own people, to be messaging to their own people, the importance of doing business with your own people. You know, to rely on your own people for goods and services there locally in the community, and not having to go, you know, to Rapid City 2-3 hours away, and really getting to understand what's the cost benefit of that, that it's actually in your personal financial best interest to do business with those businesses that are owned and operated by your own people, because there's incredible cost savings for you that you may not immediately realize. And then on the external side of things, it's things like I already mentioned: academic partners, private partners, other tribes. One of the things that's really bubbled to the fore in our work on the toolkit, and we have about 24 formal contributors to the toolkit, including some of the folks that I mentioned earlier, some of the folks that were on our panel discussion at our annual convention. They're really talking about how can tribes begin to more fully engage in intertribal commerce at a much greater level, and what does that look like, and how do we facilitate that as an organization at NCAI? And here's the last of the 4 major visuals we're going to be incorporating. We wanted to kind of create a checklist, kind of simplify a lot of the themes and issues and recommendations that we're going to be touching on, and all 11 of the considerations in the toolkit, kind of boil it down into a shorthand checklist. Like, this is something that, you know, tribe leaders could print out at a council meeting and just kind of whip through this in about an hour and figure out, oh man, where are we at in this? Are we doing much of any of this stuff? You know, so for example, and granted, there's some overlap here. You could argue some of these may belong in a different category, but we're trying to simplify it. So we came up with this rights, tools, advantages paradigm here that we think, generally speaking, works. But when it comes to rights, you know, are you exercising your right to self-govern, you know, using a tribal constitution governance system of your own design, as I touched on before? You know, unfortunately for a lot of tribal leaders, the answer to that one's going to be no, we're not exercising self-governance with our own governing institutions. We're using someone else's IRA or whatever it might be. Are you regulating tribal land and natural resources in alignment with your economy building priorities? Have you created the necessary laws and codes? Are you doing self-governance, contracting, and compacting in ways that could help you build your economy? And if not, why not? Is it a capacity challenge? If so, what work do you have to do in that area? Do you have intergovernmental agreements in place that facilitate, you know, economy building? Because as a sovereign, you have the ability to do that. You can enter into MOAs and MOUs with whoever you want. And then the issue of taro, for example. And then, so you see here, there's these tools and advantages sections as well, which touch on everything from, you know, uniform commercial code. You know, do you have a fair and independent court system that can resolve commercial disputes, which is a huge challenge, as many of you know, across Indian country, and can really be a killer when it comes to trying to get commerce going on a reservation. And then you see here under advantages, where are you at in terms of your formal relationship with whatever CDFI, native CDFI serves your community? Obviously, if it's chartered by the tribe or you know, a creation of the tribe, that sort of answers that question to a certain degree. But if you have a native CDFI that's serving multiple tribes, for example, what's the state of the relationship between that specific tribal government and the native CDFI? And could that relationship be strengthened to empower that nation's economy building efforts in much more dynamic ways? So I should mention the toolkit we're looking to release sometime in the spring. We're targeting March or April. And then in June, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be releasing it's going to be June or July, probably maybe around our mid-year conference. We're going to be releasing a much more focused short form educational resource for tribal leaders and key decision makers that's really focused directly on this issue of economic leakage in tribal communities. So as a tribal leader, as a tribal government, do you have a handle on the extent to which you are losing your latent economic power that you currently possess? Meaning all of the revenue that the tribe generates, all of the money that comes into the tribe through federal appropriations, et cetera. Do you have a handle on just how much of that is quickly leaking off the reservation? a good example of this is Rosebud. Weezy Pond, Little Elk shared during his presentation at annual convention that theirs is astronomically high. And that if they were able to figure out how to capture that, the economic impact would be off the charts. It would transform the Rosebud community virtually overnight if they could plug all those holes. And so we're really wanting to get them to focus on that. Yes, tribes need and deserve more resources from the federal government based upon trust and treaty responsibilities to strengthen their communities, build robust economies and all that. But you can do so much more with what you already have. And by being more intentional in this area. So looking at that issue of leakage and then talking about how do you actually capture that? You capture that by, as I've talked about, you build and sustain citizen-owned businesses, you recreate what was once a vibrant system of local tribal commerce that once was the bedrock of every single tribal society, which explained why they thrived for millennia before federal policies came along. And then how do you again create that direct commerce between the tribal government as an entity, its enterprises, and others in the community, so that you're again capturing more and more of that money and making sure it's maximizing its impact before it ultimately leaves the community. And I should mention that's going to feature it's going to be a 7 to 8 minute scripted video with a series of really cool animated graphics. I don't know how many of you are aware of it's called the Res We Live On video series that the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes developed about 10 years ago now. They developed a series of, they were about 2-minute animated infographic videos. Strongly recommend you check them out, that were designed to dispel the myths and stereotypes about tribal governments and tribal sovereignty. Do Indians pay taxes? Of course they do. Do Indians all get per cap checks? Of course they don't. Short pieces on tribal sovereignty and taxation and all this other kind of stuff. Really cool stuff. And we're trying to model it after that. So it's going to be a short form video, and then it's going to have a how-to companion guide that'll be useful for how do you teach this in a tribal college and university classroom? How can tribal leadership groups and high-level tribal senior manager types, how can they use this? How can they watch this thing and then actually implement some of what they learned?
Oh, it's called The Res We Live On?
Yeah, the Res, I think it's just the Res We Live On. If you just look up the Res We Live On, REZ, yeah, check it out. We've talked with Rob McDonald, who's their PR director there at Salish Kootenai. We've talked to him in the not too distant past about figuring out a way to nationalize those, because they are skewed a little bit to Montana and the tribe itself, but the basic messages are incredibly powerful. The medium through which they share those messages is incredibly effective, and it's something that I share out all the time because I think it's one of the best tools for learning a lot about the basics of Indian country and tribal sovereignty and the unique political status of tribes as governments in just a short period of time.
Cool.
Yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to share is through the generous support of google.org, we are, and I should mention google.org is funding that last curriculum piece I mentioned. And in addition, they're giving us they gave us an initial pot of money to support this small business stabilization grant program. And then we recently learned that they were going to give us an additional $1 million or so to expand the program. And so with that initial slug of money, we awarded 38 Native-owned small businesses across the country. We gave them $5,000 grants. And so these are really designed to help a lot of the Native-owned small businesses stay alive through the pandemic. We immediately saw the impact it was going to have on all those vendors, for example, that make their living on the Indian conference circuit, whether it's NCI conferences or NCIED and all these other major conferences that had to go virtual. they're not able to set up shop and sell their wares at conferences. And we said, what can we do to help them? And so we came up with this initiative. Google very generously decided to fund it. And we just recently opened up the second RFA window, which will result in 80 additional awards. And so the URL is right there. I have a colleague of mine who's running this thing. I can't remember exactly when this current RFA window will close, but I would recommend that strongly recommend that if you guys serve among your client base, small business owners, to let them know about this opportunity, to let them know to get their application in as soon as possible. It is a very simple application. We don't ask for a lot in the way of documentation. And the reporting requirements involved are very minimal as well, in that we just want to know how you spent the money and what good it did. We're really looking to help tide businesses over until, hopefully this pandemic subsides in the next few months and we can get back to some semblance of business as usual. There will be an additional RFA window that will open sometime early next year, in which we'll then make the additional 80 awards, and it may be 85 for each now. I'm looking at the picture there. I think we're saying 170 businesses. So I think we're going to be about 85 for each window.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that's impressive. And I think we have, I guess, quite a bit to learn from you, Ian. And and your fundraising with Google, I think, is really impressive as well. So I think there's a bunch of different ways we could take this, but I also got some questions that I received. So I want to just kind of open it up, see if some of those folks had questions. I think first one was Sam. You have a question? For Dr.
Yeah, I did. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Jackson. The main question that I had actually ties back into the slide in which we were talking about different entities and their roles in developing tribal economies and preserving tribal sovereignty. And I was wondering what leverage tribal governments might have over state governments, and encouraging state governments to enter into MOUs with tribal governments in order to foster that tribal economic development.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say that there's no easy answer to that. I think so much depends on generally what the relationship is between tribes in a particular state and that state government's leadership. As Cindy and others in Oklahoma can attest, a lot depends on who's in the governor's mansion at the time. I know right now is maybe not a good time for that kind of stuff, but I do think one of the things we've really been pushing tribal leaders to do or figure out how to get done is documenting your economic impact and the ripple effect that it has on outside of the reservation boundaries and beyond your own tribal citizens, so that you're equipped with what the ammunition you need to push back against this false narrative that prosperity for tribes comes at the expense of everyone else in the state, right, including the state government. Obviously they have I wouldn't say legitimate, but they have it's sort of you can see why states, for instance, rebel against tribes taking more land into trust, because it takes it off the state. It takes the revenue from taxing that property out of the state coffers, et cetera. But a counteract to that argument or that position would be, well, yeah, but we more than make up for it with all the economic development we do with that land that we take back into trust. And here's the quantifiable impact it has on your state in terms of the number of state residents, non-tribal member state residents that we employ, that we pay this much income to, that they're taxed by your state at this rate, and that sort of thing. And we had early on during COVID, one of our online forums, which you can find on our YouTube channel, we brought together, I think it was Casey was part of the group, Joe Kalk from Harvard Project, and others who were crunching the data on this. what is the economic ripple effect of COVID in terms of the curtailing of tribal economic activity, and then in turn, the negative impact on beyond tribal borders, right? And so I think tribes need to, again, this is where you can leverage partnerships with academic institutions, work on these partnerships so that they can help you document the incredible economic power that tribes are exerting that benefits everyone, not just the tribe and its membership or its citizenship, right? So I think that's one effective strategy. And what we've been doing, we haven't made it as public yet, but what we've been doing is we've been searching for and collecting as many of these tribal economic impact studies as we can find. Some of them are public, some are not. Some of them were commissioned by a tribe and are proprietary property of the tribe. We have copies of some of those. We're not able to share those publicly unless we have permission, but you see across the board, it's just astronomical. The economic impact that tribes are having beyond their borders. And I think all of us need to do more to more effectively tell that story on a regular basis, because I think it will help us out in so many other different ways.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. So we've got a question from someone you know well, Sherry Black, who's a leader in the industry. And Sherry, you want to, if you can unmute, maybe it's more fun if you ask the question, I think.
I'm very nervous.
Oh, no. It was a great session, Ian. Thank you so much. Really helpful to learn all of this. I wondered with the Google grants, if there was a size limit, a floor for how big the small businesses have to be. And I'm thinking particularly of Native artists. You mentioned the vendors at conferences, which, would be somewhat small, but I wondered if there was any size limit.
There's no limit. I can tell you that we have, when we went this exercise with the 38 that we selected, it was maybe 3 months ago now. We really wanted to prioritize a few things. First, a diversity of type of business. Second, a regional diversity, because we are a national organization. We want to make sure we were covering, businesses all over the country. And we achieved that with the first 38. I can't remember how many states were represented, but it was a high number. And then we really wanted to try to prioritize smaller businesses, meaning ones where that $5,000 award is really going to be a huge difference maker. And we, for example, we had a number of applications come in from businesses who had an annual operating budget of like over $1 million, and we said, well, you're a small business technically, but is $5,000 really going to make that much of a difference if you're in trouble to the tune of $150,000, $200,000, right? Is that really going to make the difference? And so I think those are just kind of the general criteria. I know we're going to go back and refine those criteria moving forward, but I would imagine those three are still going to be in play. And certainly sole proprietorships, arts and crafts type vendors, those would be at the top of our list.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. And then just a quick second question about if there's any updates on NCAI leadership in terms of what's happening in the CEO position you can share?
Sure. Well, and before I answer that question, I want to acknowledge, for those of you who don't know, that I took over for Sherry at NCAI, leading the partnership with tribal governance, and I'm still trying to grow my feet to fit in those shoes, but but I really appreciate her mentorship. She did extend her 9-year retirement one more year to help get me grounded before she moved on. And of course, as all of you know, she's not really retired anyway. But
nope.
But in terms of the leadership transition, if we haven't posted it today, we will in the next day or so be posting the position opening for the CEO of NCAI, and I believe the executive committee of the NCAI board, so that would be our 4 officers, will be overseeing that process. And I don't really have much more information than that, and I don't know what the timetable is for a decision on who the new CEO will be. But we have a really great team of interim leadership, selected from among the senior staff that have fulfilled that role in the past at certain junctures, and so we're charging it forward like it's business as usual.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the update.
Cool. Thanks for the question, Sherry. And I think we have a question from Casey Lazar from the Federal Reserve. If you can unmute, Casey, that'd be great. And if not, I'll read your question.
Sure, Jackson, it was just more of a comment. I just appreciated Ian's point that you're making about when tribal economies grow and tribes experience economic success, that it has real tangible positive impacts in state and local government or local economies. And I think that's something that I know the Federal Reserve is particularly interested in continuing to do research on to demonstrate that it's not a zero-sum game when tribes succeed. So just appreciate seeing that somewhat included in each of the slides that you had, or at least the idea embedded in the slides that you put together. So thanks for understanding.
Yeah, and I should mention too that we have plans in place to bring on additional staff in the first part of next year to revive NCAI's Tribal State Relations Initiative. We've continued to work organically in that area, but we want to be more intentional, and a central message of that effort will be what I shared, is that economic prosperity for tribes is a good thing for states and and the country as a whole.
Cool, great. And we got a question from Dave Castillo from Tempe, Arizona.
Hey, Ian. Yeah, Dave here at Native Community Capital. I'm sorry I missed a lot of this, and if you've already covered this, no worries. I just with the new administration coming into place, I was concerned that we haven't seen any kind of really robust tribal economic development policy proposal come forward, and I'm not sure who would come forward from. Whether NAFO or NCI or NCN or some collaboration, something really bold. Tribal leaders used to talk about how after the World War II there was a Marshall Plan, but tribes never got their own Marshall Plan, and there's still a lot of building and rebuilding and growth and access to capital and tax credit, access to different kinds of enhancements and whatnot. Like, where is that? Who's leading the charge there? And what's the collaboration look like between tribal leadership on a regional level and the various national Native organizations?
Yeah, so a couple things on that. One is at our recent annual convention, we ratified the NCAI transition plan, which features all the major policy sections you could think of, and in that is economic development, which was worked on with many of those partners you just mentioned. And now our staff is working to develop short, medium, and long range action plans on those. And we're already having discussions with the Biden transition team. Our board actually had a pretty robust conversation with Kevin Washburn and several other members of the Indian Country segment of the transition team on Wednesday. And I should mention too, I mentioned this to Jackson yesterday, that Clara Pratt, formerly of the Native SBA, Native Office of the SBA, and also the Navajo Nation's DC office, is working with Kevin Washburn on the DOI team. But given her background, I think it could be a real asset for us in pushing forward our priorities in economic development broadly, but then of course the specific priorities for Native CDFIs. I think at our board meeting next week, Jackson, we had talked about really kicking around strategy on that, given that we do have great connections with the right people in the Biden transition team to make sure that this is front and center in their thoughts and in their actions, when they take office on January 20th. The second thing I'd share just briefly is that towards the summer, fall of 2021, we have in mind to convene a major economic policy summit that would then result in a policy report similar to the one that NCAI and the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development collaborated to do back in 2007. And we want to update that and make sure that it gets into the bloodstream of the new Congress administration before too much more time passes. Obviously, you know, there's been some great developments. The Incubators Act was passed. As Jackson mentioned, the ICE Act is getting across the finish line. And so that it's an optimal time to update our priorities anyway, now that we've achieved some of these things that we've had on our plate for so long.
Okay. Yeah. And just to double down, I mean, you know, between ICWA and water rights and gaming and, just everything that tribal leaders have to deal with, you know, do you see any risk of this kind of getting overshadowed by any other major issue, whether it's, you know, the case in Oklahoma or anything like that? Or do you feel like there's enough momentum here and recognition that, you know, between native CDFIs and really progressive efforts by, you know, some tribes and others around the country that, you know, we could really kind of have a breakout kind of term here with the Biden administration around, you know, what native CDFIs do and tribal economic development generally?
Well, I mean, we're approaching it like we should accept nothing less, that's for sure. And I think, you know, we do have with several of our partners, we have released, including NCN on a regular basis. I think it's every year. In February, we've been updating and releasing a partners brief on how the federal government can support tribal economic development and native CDFI. I think there's might even be a whole section on native. It's a very short thing. It's a 2-pager. It's meant to be a, you know, Cliff Notes version of our greatest priorities, but there is a section in there, if not a section, at least several provisions dealing with native CDFIs and how do we empower them. And, you know, the NACA match waiver being one of them, which now hopefully we can remove from that list and add in some other things that we feel are imperatives now that some of these existing recommendations have been achieved.
Thank you.
All right. Well, great. We're right at the end of the time, so we're going to have to cut it off. Ian, do you want to? It looks like you quickly responded to Joanna's question about housing. You want to add anything?
No, I mean, yeah, homeownership we'll address in the toolkit in the infrastructure area and in some of the other areas about how do you empower your own people to participate in the economy. And one of the ways is, you know, you prepare them to become homeowners. And I did want to, I don't know if she's still on. I wanted to give a shout out to Cheryl Ellenwood. I saw her on the call. She's one of my former staffers at University of Arizona. So I think she hopped off, but.
Cool. Well, Ian, we really appreciate your time and your expertise and making, raising the profile of native CDFIs and the other conversations that you have. And I don't know if Pete Upton's still on the call, see if he has any final words. He was having some audio trouble the other day. Okay, well, all right. Well, Cindy Middleset, you want to say anything? Take us out. Looking at my board. All right. Well, again, really appreciate your time, Ian, and everybody. Great to see you. We're on next week. Oh, go ahead, Cindy. Well, we're on next week, and then we're on again on the 18th of December. The 18th of December, we'll get a little deeper into that impact investing, individual investors wanting to invest in native CDFIs discussion. So we're looking forward to that. And then come January, we're gonna have the Federal Reserve come back and talk a bit more about the Community Reinvestment Act, what they're doing, and have more of a formal listening session so that we're able to ask some questions and then hopefully get some answers in real time before they move forward with our advance notice of proposed rulemaking. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And you all have a great weekend. Bye-bye.